It's not a secret that the West is not happy with the fact that African countries are shifting away from partnering with them and turning to non-Western partners, particularly Russia. However, in recent times, there has been one Western country that has been increasingly vocal even more than the others about the presence of Russia in Africa. This country is none other than France, the former colonial master of more than 14 African countries. And there is only one word that can describe France's attitude toward.
As the country moves to tighten control over cobalt exports, President Felix Tshisekedi has issued a warning. According to media reports, the president has said that the country will permanently ban cobalt exporters that violate its new quota system. The DRC is the world's top producer of cobalt, which is a critical electric battery metal. Now, the country provided around 70% of the global supply.
Think about the Sahel region, one of the poorest, yet fastest growing demographically. The succession of military coups will make the region more unstable for years ahead. Russia is both influencing and benefiting from the crisis, and the region has become fertile ground to the rise of terrorism. This is of direct concern for Europe, for our security and our prosperity. So we need to show the same unity of purpose towards Africa as we have shown towards Ukraine. This is a must. We need to focus on cooperation with legitimate governments and regional organizations. We need to develop a mutually beneficial partnership which focuses on common issues for Europe and Africa. And this is why, together with HRVP Borrell, we will work on a new strategic approach to take forward at the next EU-AU summit.
Africa has been the provider. If you look at Europe, Europe cannot survive without Africa. One situation that people don't realize, post-World War, when the US came up with the Marshall Plan, what they don't tell you is that the contribution through exploitation of African minerals was actually the biggest funder of the European Recovery Plan, ERP, aka the Marshall Plan. US contributed $13 billion, which is now present day $175 billion, which, by the way, the American taxpayer must be paid back. Nobody's asking for that money back. But what they don't tell you is that Africa, through exploitation of its resources by the Europeans, was actually a much, much bigger contribution to the European recovery post-World War II.
For decades, Europe operated under a quiet assumption. Africa would always depend on its markets, its currency systems, its aid packages, its diplomatic approval. But by the time European leaders realized what was happening, Africa had already closed the door. Trade routes were rerouted, contracts were canceled, ambassadors were recalled, and long-standing agreements that once favored European profit had been torn apart. The world watched in disbelief as a historic reversal unfolded. Africa had cut Europe off, deliberately and decisively, and Europe could not stop it. It didn't happen in a single day. It began with a silent rebellion in key African capitals, where political and economic leaders finally acknowledged what history had proven for centuries. Dependency was not accidental, it was engineered. Every trade agreement, every export quota, every development partnership had been designed to ensure Europe remained the center of profit, while African nations supplied raw materials, cheap labor, and compliant votes in global institutions. But this time, Africa had leverage. It had options. It had partners beyond Europe, and those partners were offering something Europe never truly did: equality. The first shift was minerals. For years, Europe relied heavily on African cobalt, manganese, uranium, bauxite, and rare earths essential for high-tech manufacturing, renewable energy, and defense. African governments, for the first time, coordinated export controls across borders. They demanded value addition at home, no more raw materials leaving the continent unprocessed. Europe panicked. German car manufacturers pleaded for exemptions, French energy companies sent envoys, and the European Council issued statement after statement, but Africa held the line. Next came agriculture. African states, empowered by new infrastructure and regional trading blocs, redirected massive export volumes toward Asia and the Middle East. Grain that once fed European markets was now supplying Gulf states. Coffee and cocoa that once arrived at Belgian ports were now processed in Africa and sold directly to Asian consumers. European distributors found themselves cut out of chains they once controlled entirely. Then came the diplomatic rupture. The African Union announced a new foreign policy framework that excluded European observer status for the first time in history. Meetings that once required European approval now moved forward without informing Brussels. European think tanks called it hostile, ungrateful, and economically reckless. African leaders simply called it independence, but nothing symbolized the break more than the rejection of European currencies. In a move that stunned financial markets, several African regions collectively abandoned their reliance on European-linked currency reserves. New digital payment systems backed by commodity wealth and backed by alliances with Asia and the Middle East replaced the euro-based clearing systems that had dominated trade for decades. Europe lost its ability to manipulate African monetary policies. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Europe's reaction was immediate but ineffective. Officials threatened to cut aid, only to discover that Africa no longer needed it. They threatened to suspend investments, only to realize that Chinese, Indian Way, South Korean, and even South American capital had already filled the gap. Sanctions were quietly discussed, but Europe no longer had the leverage, and imposing them risked destabilizing its own supply chain. Factories slowed, energy projects stalled, raw material prices soared. European economies, already strained by aging populations and soaring debt, suddenly faced shortages and mounting inflation. Africa, once dismissed as a minor player in global economics, had just proven its influence. The breaking point came when a major European port collapsed into financial crisis after losing its African shipping contracts. As container traffic redirected toward Indian Ocean and Asian routes, the once dominant gateway fell silent. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Newspapers called it a strategic disaster. African economists called it the beginning of balance. And beneath all the headlines, a quieter truth emerged. Africa didn't cut off Europe out of hatred. It did it out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from centuries of extraction, manipulation, conditional loans, and lectures about democracy from nations that once plundered its wealth. The continent had tried reform, diplomacy, and negotiation. None of it changed the imbalance. So Africa did the only thing left: walked away. Europe now faces a crisis with no blueprint. It has no control over Africa's new alliances, no influence over its new banking systems, no access to its mineral reserves without paying market terms, no moral superiority left to claim. The era of European dominance in Africa is over, not because Europe changed, but because Africa stopped waiting for it to change. And as the new world economic map is drawn, the most ironic part is this: Africa isn't closing its doors to the world. It's simply choosing who gets to knock, in Europe, for the first time in history, is not at the front of the line. For Europe, this isn't just an economic emergency. It is a psychological crisis. The continent that once controlled African destinies is now begging for access. The economies that once dictated policy are now watching helplessly from the sidelines. Africa has moved on, not in anger but in power, and Europe can't stop it, because Africa no longer needs to ask for permission. The rupture between Africa and Europe had already shaken global markets, but Bloc 2 is where the real shift became undeniable, where Africa not only cut ties but built a new system designed to replace Europe altogether. What unfolded was not chaos, but strategy. Not rebellion, but restructuring. Africa didn't just walk away from Europe, it walked towards something radically different. And the world began to understand that the continent was no longer positioning itself as a junior partner in global trade. It was positioning itself as a central pillar. The foundation of this transformation was alliances, new alliances, deeper than any Europe had ever offered. For decades, European governments insisted that Africa had no viable alternatives. But as soon as Africa shut the door, global powers rushed to knock. China, India, Brazil, Turkey, the Way, and even Russia saw an opportunity in Europe's absence. What Europe had taken for granted, others treated as strategic gold. Africa's first move was the multilateral commodity exchange, a new trading infrastructure that cut European brokers out entirely. For the first time, African countries sold oil, lithium, cocoa, timber, and gas directly to buyers without European intermediaries taking the largest cut. What once took weeks of clearance through European ports now happened instantly through blockchain-backed digital trading hubs in Nairobi, Lagos, Cairo, and Johannesburg. The message was clear. If Europe wanted access, it would have to play by Africa's terms. Next came manufacturing. Africa had spent centuries exporting raw resources and importing finished products at 10 times the value. But now investment was flowing into homegrown processing plants and industrial corridors funded by non-European partners. Refineries, steel mills, biotech labs, and semiconductor facilities were being built from Morocco to Angola. Europe's biggest fear had come true. Africa was no longer just exporting resources, it was preparing to export high-value products. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The same minerals once shipped to Europe for luxury cars and electronics were now being processed and assembled in African factories for African brands and Asian markets. Europe, meanwhile, faced severe supply chain disruptions and price surges. Industries dependent on African inputs from EV batteries to aerospace components began losing competitiveness. What Europe once considered its right was now a privilege, and Africa was not handing it out freely. Even more disruptive was the shift in energy. Europe, long dependent on African oil and gas, found itself squeezed as new. Long-term contracts were signed with Asia at premium rates. Gas pipelines that once led to southern Europe were now feeding African-powered export zones. Solar megafarms and hydroelectric grids powered manufacturing hubs that had once been idle. Africa was not just exporting energy, it was becoming the world's next powerhouse of renewable exports, at a moment when Europe struggled under energy shortages and rising utility costs. But the most devastating blow to European influence wasn't economic, it was ideological. Africa began reshaping global institutions. At international summits, African nations collectively blocked European-led resolutions. Trade organizations began restructuring membership tiers. International lenders found themselves watched, challenged, and resisted by a unified African voting bloc. For the first time in modern history, Africa dictated the rules instead of following them, and Europe was not prepared. European think tanks released panicked reports warning of strategic isolation. Headlines spoke of economic decoupling, but beneath their fear was a deeper realization the power imbalance had reversed. Africa was no longer appealing to Europe. Europe was begging for relevance. The crisis escalated when a group of African nations announced their withdrawal from security cooperation frameworks that had allowed European military influence on African soil for decades. Bases were closed, advisors were expelled, intelligence agreements were terminated. European officials claimed it threatened global security. But African governments argued that their sovereignty was finally being restored. Africa, once seen as a zone of intervention, had become a zone of exclusion. Still, the real disaster for Europe was psychological. Every strategy it once used pressure, sanctions, diplomatic persuasion failed. Threats only deepened Africa's resolve. Lectures only strengthened alliances elsewhere. For the first time in centuries, Europe had no control over African choices. Meanwhile, African cities were transforming. New financial districts rose where colonial banks once dictated policy. Electric rail lines connected capital cities to industrial zones. Students began attending technology institutes funded by Asian scholarships instead of European aid. Africa was reinventing itself with partners that saw profit, not paternalism. Europe watched all this in disbelief. It had assumed African unity was impossible. It believed the continent lacked the infrastructure, political will, and global support to break away. But it had underestimated something powerful: collective memory. Centuries of resource theft, currency manipulation, political interference, and conditional loans had built a quiet fury. And when the opportunity came, Africa acted as one. What terrified Europe most was not Africa's anger, but Africa's confidence. The continent was no longer reacting defensively, it was leading proactively. It wasn't trying to rejoin European markets, it was designing new ones. It wasn't trying to reform colonial systems, it was replacing them. The balance had shifted from dependency to autonomy, and the world noticed. Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even parts of the Middle East began studying Africa's model: resource control, alliance diversification, currency independence, and unified policy. Africa had not just broken away, it had set a precedent. The post-colonial world finally had a playbook. In Brussels, emergency meetings continued every week, but there was no solution. The only path forward required Europe to accept a truth it had resisted for centuries. Africa was no longer a supplier. It was a competitor. It was a leader. It was a power. And the separation, once dismissed as impossible, was now irreversible. Europe, for the first time in history, was outside the center of Africa's future. The continent it once controlled was building a new world, and Europe was only watching through the window. Bloc 3 would only prove it further. Africa wasn't just cutting Europe off, it was replacing it. The tension between Africa and Europe, once dismissed as political theater, had now hardened into an irreversible economic rupture. What had begun as diplomatic silence evolved into a total freeze, and every side understood that there was no going back. Europe, long accustomed to dictating terms, suddenly found itself begging for resources. At the mercy of nations it once humiliated. It wasn't just about trade anymore, this was about dignity, sovereignty, and a world that had shifted its axis. The final blow didn't involve missiles or armies. It came quietly in conference rooms across Africa, where leaders sat, looked each other in the eye, and agreed they were done. They were done exporting uranium cheaply to nuclear-powered industries in Europe. They were done selling cobalt, gold, oil, and gas for pennies while their own people struggled. They were done honoring treaties written in European capitals. They were done being lectured while being looted. This time, Africa walked away not in anger, but with strategic precision. Europe first believed it was bluff. It had always worked before. When African nations threatened to cut exports, Europe used sanctions, media pressure, and diplomatic intimidation to force compliance. But this time, the world was different. Africa now had options. The continent no longer needed Europe as the gateway to global markets. It had China's railways, Russia's nuclear technology, India's pharmaceuticals, Turkey's factories, Brazil's agricultural cooperation, and Gulf-funded megaprojects. The bargaining chip Europe thought it owned was gone. The monopoly on power had dissolved. African leaders issued a joint declaration. No exports of strategic minerals too. Europe without equitable contracts and fair global pricing. The message was clear. The era of free extraction was finished. Overnight, European stock markets plunged as investors realized that everything from electric cars to military drones depended on resources now locked behind African borders. Factories in Germany, France, Spain, and Italy halted production not for lack of technology, but because raw materials no longer flowed. Across Europe, protests grew. Households already burdened by inflation watched grocery prices double as Africa stopped supplying coffee, cocoa, and food commodities through the old trade routes. Diplomats attempted to negotiate, but Africa refused secret meetings. All discussions had to be public, transparent, and equal. That alone humiliated European officials who were accustomed to controlling outcomes. Western media panicked. Headlines warned of economic collapse and unprecedented dependency on Africa. Analysts who once dismissed African leaders as unstable were now forced to speak of them as world Shepherds. European energy ministers admitted that without African gas and uranium, there would be blackouts within months. The dream of a green transition stumbled because the cobalt and manganese that powered batteries were sitting in African warehouses, waiting for new buyers. But Africa wasn't suffering. In fact, this was the most coordinated act of economic resistance the continent had ever seen. Instead of watching their wealth leave through colonial pipelines, African countries began refining minerals locally, building factories in their own cities, and investing in processing plants. New trade routes expanded across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic, except they bypassed Europe entirely. Trade with Asia tripled, manufacturing zones turned into job hubs, and for the first time in history, millions of young Africans saw opportunity without having to migrate. Schools taught aerospace engineering instead of memorizing colonial history. Languages like Mandarin, Turkish, Arabic, and Swahili spread into business spaces where French and Portuguese once dominated. Africa wasn't just breaking trade ties, it was rewiring its cultural orientation. The West called it a crisis. Africa called it liberation. Meanwhile, in Europe, desperation began turning into resentment. Political parties rose, demanding that their governments take back control of African resources. Some extremists openly suggested military intervention, an idea instantly rejected by more rational voices who knew Africa was now backed by nuclear powers in the East. If Europe attempted force, it would trigger a global war it could not win. So instead, Europe attempted sabotage. Disinformation campaigns spread online claiming African governments were unstable, corrupt, or collapsing. But the world didn't believe them anymore. Too many countries had seen the hypocrisy of Western lectures on democracy while they funded coups, armed dictators, and built fortunes through exploitation. Africa didn't need to defend itself. The truth was visible. Then came the move Europe never expected. Africa announced it was creating a single export pricing charter. No nation would sell strategic minerals below the agreed global rate, and no country would break ranks. Africa, once fragmented by borders drawn in European capitals, was now coordinating like a single economic force. It wasn't a political union nor a federal state, but it was something even more powerful, a united interest. Foreign investors once treated Africa as a risk. Now they treated it as the center of the world's future economy. The world's largest semiconductor plant was being constructed in North Africa with Middle Eastern funding. A West African country launched its first satellite. An East African country introduced a digital payment system that replaced Western banks in cross-border trade. Africa wasn't just exporting raw materials now, it exported technology, knowledge, and investment. Europe pleaded for dialogue, but African negotiators responded with a single phrase: "We will talk when you are ready to listen." Not obey, not negotiate under pressure. Listen. For the first time in 500 years, Africa controlled the terms, not through war, not through protest, through economic strategy and the power of owning what the world needed. And in cities across Africa, people celebrated not with fireworks, but with silence and pride. A quiet understanding spread through the continent. The colonized had become the gatekeepers. The exploited had become the architects. Europe's fate now rested on decisions made in African capitals. The balance of power had finally shifted, and there was no turning back.